Hey guys, Pastor Daniel here, doing our leadership podcast, and we're in a portion of our leadership development where we've been talking about course correction. There's a lot of different areas and skills and competencies that are necessary when we talk about course correction. But today, I want to talk about maybe one of the more feared skills that there is to learn, and that is having difficult conversations or having awkward conversations. And the thing is that when it comes to leadership, there's just no avoiding having difficult conversations. There is tension in leadership. There's tension in leading people. There's tension in just relationships in general. And if you're going to lead well, you're going to have a lot of difficult conversations throughout your ministry or your career. So let me talk about 4 areas that I think are and I was trying to, really classify what are the toughest conversations to have. What are the toughest types of conversations to have? One of them is correction. I mean, just you're doing assessments and evaluations of people in your ministry or in your job, and correcting people, especially when the performance is poor. That's very difficult to do. It can be awkward and difficult in ministry, particularly, or in relationships. Calling out sin, calling out something that you see that's just a wrong. That is a difficult conversation. That can be very awkward. Or righting a wrong that you see. When we talk about practicing Matthew 18 with someone or correcting something, that can be very difficult. We can fear those types of conversations. Another one I think a lot of us really avoid that is a difficult conversation is when we're expressing a hurt to someone. So they hurt us in some manner, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. But either way, it hurt, and we need to tell them about it and have a conversation. The number of people that don't have that conversation, just sort of cover that thing up and hope that it goes away. It's remarkable. And yet we're instructed to go to the person to talk to them about it. Now, that one is particularly difficult, I think, because almost always we're emotional. We're emotional because of the hurt, and that emotion is then added on to the conversation we need to go have. And it's difficult to separate the hurt and the emotion in that hurt and wound from the actual conversation. A third is clarifying something sensitive. So, sometimes you realize that maybe you weren't very exact in a description. Maybe someone's expectations very different than reality, or your expectations different than someone else's. And you need to clarify that, and yet it's a sensitive subject, and so you're avoiding clarifying those expectations or clarifying that subject matter. And then the last one I think is very common in terms of difficult conversation is delivering bad news. I've been a manager and executive in a lot of businesses, and firing people is very difficult. The funny thing is, even firing people that are just terrible at their job is very difficult. I remember someone, one time I worked at Starbucks as a manager for a while, and I remember firing someone that was just abysmal. They were late all the time. They missed all the time. They were a horrible employee. But it was still tough to fire them, and they knew they needed to be fired, and yet that was still an emotional conversation, and it was still difficult to do that, and so therefore there was still some fear even going into having that conversation. So correcting someone, expressing a hurt, clarifying something sensitive, and delivering bad news. These are some of our top things that lead to awkward conversations or difficult conversations, and because of that, many of us, if not all of us, avoid those things. We look at that as a negative thing. We put it off. We sweep it under the rug. Lots of weird dysfunctional behavior around not wanting to have a tough conversation. Why? If we were just to peel this back, why do we do that? Why do we keep putting it off? Because if you've had those difficult conversations, I'm sure you've had bad ones, but I'm sure you've also had good ones. And so why is it that we tend to always look at difficult conversations as being such a negative with no potential positive? Well, yes, part of it is that we think of it as that there could lead to conflict, right? It could lead to a bad reaction, some sort of conflict. But I think more than that, it's twofold. And I want you to think about this when you think about conflict and you think about having tough conversations. One of them is this. One of them is oftentimes we fear that the reaction from the other person is going to be negative, and that their perception of us will change because of it. Now, what's interesting about that is what we're really saying is that some of our identity, maybe just a little bit of it, maybe not a lot, but some of our identity is actually tied up in the way that we're perceived by that person. And that's kind of interesting because it's dangerous, right? that we might avoid having a conversation because we don't want the perception to change. That's very dysfunctional. We can really get into the root of that is not good. The second is this, and this is just a really good point that Pastor Russ and I were talking about. Many times we would rather choose for what we would call pseudo peace, like, don't upset the apple cart, which is a phrase that goes all the way back to Roman times, centuries old. Don't upset the apple cart, just leave things as they are. That this pseudo peace, that things on the surface seem okay, so just don't dive any deeper. But what we're sacrificing by doing that is real unity, like real relationship. Because what happens is, we know in a relationship, if we have this surface level relationship with someone where we're not actually able to have tough conversations because we keep avoiding them, because we don't want to upset the apple cart, we want to keep the peace, that we don't have a real relationship with that person. We can't really share what's going on because we keep avoiding tough conversations. So therefore, anything that might upset that pseudo peace is avoided. And we lack real unity. See, because in real unity comes a lot of tension, where you can actually expose what's going on in your heart and what's going on in your life in reality, and not worry about whether or not the impact of the consequence of the conversation is somehow going to be negative. So without that, we don't have real unity. We have this surface faux level. And let's be honest, we've all seen that sort of extrapolated out on a larger scale. We've seen how that pseudo peace, that surface level, we hate it. Like if you go to a church and everybody's surface level, you hate that. You think it's the worst thing ever. And yet, each time you avoid the tough conversation, you're contributing to that. So as a leader, it's our job to really get into those deep conversations, which means awkward and tough and difficult conversations. It's our job. Okay, therefore, because it's our job, because it's a biblical mandate, because true leadership really gets to the core of the issue and doesn't avoid tough conversations, how do we do that? So I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about how we prepare for a difficult conversation, and I want to talk about how we actually have the difficult conversation. Preparing for a difficult conversation. All right, so here's the first thing. Do not wait too long. This is the thing that everybody wants to do, is they want to put it off, right? We overanalyze it, and we think about it, and we worry about it, we do all these things, but we keep pushing it because we don't want to have it. And what I'm telling you is, look, I'm not saying rush into it like haphazardly, like as soon as it happens, you just, you do it out in public or something. Look, the setting is important, right? We do want to do it privately if possible, but you got to have an urgency to have the conversation, not pushing it off and kicking the can down the road and punting it, because it actually gets worse with time. I want you to hear that. If you don't have the conversation, it gets worse with time. It gets worse for a lot of reasons, and I'll explain some of those reasons in a second. But if you punt that can down the road and you continue to avoid that conversation, the facts get fuzzy, the perception of the event, the hurt, the eval, whatever it was, gets fuzzy. You cannot delay that too long. There has to be an urgency. Okay. Time makes this worse. In fact, I'll give you a quick example. I had someone who came to me at some point and said they needed to confront me with something that I had hurt them, a statement that I had made that they had overheard hurt them. They came to me 2 years after I made the statement. 2 years later. Now, I barely remembered any of the facts surrounding any of this thing because it was 2 years earlier, but also they had worn the burden of this hurt for 2 years without actually coming and talking to me about it. You can't do that. I mean, that's just a mess, right? It's got to be an urgency. All right. Number 2, big thing on preparing to have a difficult conversation, stop having the conversation in your head. This is the number one problem with difficult conversations, is what makes them exponentially worse than they actually, it makes what makes you think that they're worse than they usually actually are, is you keep having the conversation in your head. Now, I am not saying don't prepare for the conversation. I'm not saying that you shouldn't make a list of some of the facts or things, or this is a plan of stuff you need to cover in the conversation. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm talking about, and we've all done this, is stop having a narrative in your head where not only have you presented something, but then you've answered for the person. Like, well, what if they say this? Well, then I'm going to say this. Well, what if they say this? And you're writing this whole script, this whole storyline of how this conversation is going to go in your head. That is just poison. And it's poison for a bunch of reasons. It's poison because you're making all these assumptions about the person. In order to answer for them, you're actually having to guess their intent behind certain things. Ooh, that's really dangerous. When you begin to assume that they will react really, really poorly, particularly when confronted with sin, you are diminishing and sort of minimizing and underestimating the work that the Holy Spirit does in that person's life. There are a lot of just negative things about you trying to come up with this whole script. Here's what you do instead. What you do is you write out the things that you need to talk about. And we're going to get to this in just a second. And you can make a plan of what needs, you want to be very articulate as you have this conversation. But you don't want to guess the reply. You actually want to stop and listen to the replies in real time when they happen and hear them for what they are and hear them from the person's perspective. And if you spend too much time trying to build this whole narrative in your head, then if their response sounds anything, even close to the response that you thought they might have, you'll actually start to mishear, like hear incorrectly what they're saying because it'll match this story you had in your head and not what they're actually saying. It's very dangerous to do. Stop having an argument in your head. Stop having a debate in your head. Stop writing a script or a narrative in your head. Incredibly dangerous. By the way, the longer you wait to have the conversation, the more opportunity you have to write these narratives. And that's where it gets so just almost infected, right? This thing turns smelly like gangrene, right? It begins to just get infected and do these weird things in your head. You got to cut that out. You got to have an urgency to have the conversation. Get in and have it fresh as quickly as you can. All right. Here's the next thing. Stick to the facts. Stick to the facts, okay? So when you're going to plan and prep to go in and have a conversation that's tough, you're going to eval someone. Well, how am I going to do that? I'm going to evaluate their job performance. I'm going to do it with facts. I'm going to do it with objective things. Here's how you scored in these areas. Here's how you did in these areas. I'm going to match you up against your goals or your progress or whatever that is. But they're going to be objective facts. I'm going to stay as much as I can. I'm going to stay away from anything that's subjective. Now, here's a caveat to that. Caveat is if you're addressing a hurt, then you're expressing, well, here's how you made me feel. Now that is subjective, but that's still a fact. You're still saying this is how you made me feel. What is not a fact, and this is where we go wrong all the time, is when you begin to attempt to state for someone else what their intention was. When you say, well, you did this because, and you try to match whatever they did wrong, or whatever they did that you didn't understand, or their poor or evil. When you begin to try to match that to some sort of intention of theirs that you haven't even asked them about yet, you haven't even let them speak for themselves, you do a bunch of things, right? You're making an assumption about their intention. You've written a whole narrative in your head for you to have gotten that far. You're not letting them speak for themselves. You're not listening to them. Huge faux pas for you to veer off from just the facts and begin to fill in all of this intention that you've written a story about in your head. You cannot do that. So instead, stay away from stating their intention. Stay away from stating hearsay. Well, you know, so-and-so said that so-and-so said, whoa. If you're going to go do that, you go, hey, listen, there's been some weird rumblings that this might be an issue. Can you tell me about it? Stop repeating what is basically gossip that has come in a big circle. Because that's all you're doing. The moment you begin to repeat hearsay that's 2, 3, 4 people removed from you, you're just the end line of gossip. Now, at least you're coming back to the person. That's good. But just go, hey, look, I think there's an issue here. I keep hearing this. Can you tell me about it? And then shut up and listen and let them tell you about it. Okay, so what are we doing? We're not waiting too long because that's incredibly dangerous. We're going to stop having a conversation in our head and building a whole script and narrative about what's going on. That's very, very dangerous. We're going to stick to the facts. And then lastly, the preparation before you go in to have this conversation is there's got to be humility on the way in, right? So whatever it takes for you to make sure you are walking into the meeting in humility, just humbled before God, humbled before that person. There can't be any sort of arrogance around the conversation. There's got to be humility in all of these categories: in correction, in expressing a hurt, in clarifying something sensitive, and in delivering bad news. There's still humility at the root of all of those if you want those to go well, okay? Secondly, in difficult conversations, be prepared to listen. We're always spending this time when we're going to have a difficult conversation preparing all the things we're going to say. Look, there's probably not that much to say. There's probably only a couple facts and a couple questions. And then there's a shutting up and listening and letting the person talk and just trying to understand what they're saying. Remember, and we'll talk about this in a second, you've had the benefit of preparing for this conversation. They may not have. You may have called them in there to have the conversation. They had almost no idea what was going on. So be quiet and listen. And then lastly, in the preparation to have a difficult conversation, be prepared or be open to being wrong. That's right. You're going to have a difficult conversation. Be prepared that you could be wrong. Be prepared that the sin you thought that was committed was not right. You read it wrong, you saw it wrong, you heard it wrong. Be prepared that their explanation actually is really good and you just didn't see it, you didn't even see that. The number of times you're going to have a difficult conversation, you're going to go in thinking this is going to be a conflictual thing, and then someone gives you information you didn't have. It happens all the time. Be prepared to be wrong. Be prepared to be called out and need to apologize. This is all the prep to a difficult conversation. Okay, so we've not waited too long. We're just not having conversations in our head. We're sticking to the facts. We're going to write down what the facts are. These are the things we've got to get across. And then we're going to prepare with humility, ready to listen, and being prepared to be wrong. And then we're going to go into our conversation. Now, what do we do in our difficult conversation, whether we're correcting, expressing a hurt, clarifying something sensitive, or delivering bad news? Okay. If needed, when you start that conversation, if they don't know why they're in there, if they don't know they're in there for job performance, you might start the conversation with, hey, I need to have an awkward conversation with you. Sometimes that's the best way to start an awkward conversation, is just lay the cards on the table and go, hey, I'm about to get into something sensitive. Hey, I need to cover something that's kind of awkward. And I just want to acknowledge that I feel kind of awkward talking about it. There's nothing wrong with that at all, right? That's just honest. All right. Don't use mushy language. Don't use vague language. If you're going to go confront something or express something, man, be articulate, be specific. We talked about using facts, but I mean, don't round off the edges of this thing where the other person's like, I don't even know what you're talking. Like, what do you mean? We do this in the church world all the time because we think it's not going to hurt someone's feelings. So we can round off all the edges and think, oh, there'll be less conflict if I just use real vague terms. Horrible idea. Leads to all kinds of confusion and usually more dysfunction later. Be specific with the facts. Okay. Now, you can be specific, you can be direct. You're going to avoid things like maybe, possibly, probably, could be. Be specific. If someone didn't get a job, hey, you did not get this job. If I need to fire someone, hey, today is your last day. I'm terminating your employment. Not, you could lose your job, maybe this isn't the right fit for you. That's mushy language. Do not do that. Be specific in a difficult conversation. Give the person, this is the second thing, give the person time to process, particularly if you're blindsiding them with the conversation. Like if they just really don't know why they're there, if you've not given them a lot of notice of what you're going to be talking about, you've got to give them some time to process. You've had time to prepare. They are walking into this conversation. Don't rush it. Give them time. Let them process and think and ask questions, okay? The pace to this matters. Thirdly, make certain that the person understands what you're saying, even if they don't agree. You're going to seek, hey, do you understand what I'm saying about this category of job performance that you're scoring low on? Yes. Do you understand why I believe you scored low on this? Yes. Or no. Let me say it again. You got to do that. So make certain that when you've done communicating whatever this bad news is or this correction or expressing this hurt, that they understand what you've expressed, even if they don't agree with it. Because if they don't understand it, you haven't really done a great job getting that conversation out. And then lastly, and this happens, not all the time, but this happens, and this is why you prepare for it. If someone points out a failing of yours in the middle of this conversation, right? So they kind of throw it back at you, and this boomerang thing happens all the time. Be prepared to apologize. So you're in the middle of saying, hey, here's where you hurt me, and you did this thing to me, and I just needed to get it off my chest, which is a terrible thing to say actually, but I wanted to express that this wounded me and this hurt me, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. And they turn around and show you an area, maybe in the same situation, maybe in an unrelated situation where you've hurt them or you've sinned against them or just something like that. Don't dismiss it. Don't throw it away because you just got to be right and got to get your stuff out. Acknowledge it. Listen to it. And if it's real, apologize for it. But don't dismiss it. Now, with that said, you still sat down to have a conversation about something, so you're going to have to get back to that conversation. So even if it requires writing it down and coming back to it later, even if it requires owning whatever it is that they told you and apologizing, don't let that derail your conversation because you're being direct, you're being assertive, you're going to come back to that and do it again. Okay, let me see if I can recap all of this that we covered. 4 common tough conversations or categories of tough conversations that we think are most frequent. Correction, so job assessment, eval, calling out sin, righting a wrong. Expressing hurt, clarifying something sensitive, and delivering bad news. It's hard because we fear conflict. Sometimes our identity is tied up in how people perceive us, and real unity requires us to forego the surface level fake peace that we have where everyone's just getting along because no one's actually diving below the surface. How do you prepare for this? You don't wait too long. That is terrible. You definitely do not write these stories and this debate and this conversation in your head and practice it. You stick to the facts. Avoid hearsay. Make certain that you're not stating someone's intentions for them. You're just stating the facts. And you go into the conversation with humility, a willingness to listen, and an openness to being wrong. In the conversation, you don't use mushy language. You're not vague. You're direct with how articulate you are about whatever the issue or the information or the message is. You avoid words that round off the edges and are vague, like maybe, possibly, probably, could be. You give the person time to process. You make certain that they understand even if they don't agree. And if someone points out a failing of yours in the process, you are prepared to both deal with that, repent of it, address it, and make sure you finish the actual conversation that you started with. Appreciate it. We'll be back with more Leadership Podcast next month.